I'm just starting the recording. Right, good evening, everybody. And it seems to have gone a bit like winter around here. I don't know about you, but I've had to put the cover over my car to stop me having to scrape it in the morning, because that's always a nightmare on the school run. So thank you for joining us on this chillier evening, but it is obviously as the weather should be this time of the year, rather than as warm as it has been. And tonight I'm really pleased to bring Claire Taylor, who Claire grew up on a small beef farm in Scotland. She studied politics and international relations at Edinburgh University. She's a passionate storyteller and writer, and previously worked for the BBC, the Scottish Farmer, and also she worked with some on the communications for the prison programme in the early days before she went off on her Nuffield travels. She's an excellent agricultural communicator, and I really look forward to hearing your findings on turning the tide on the anti-farming agenda, Claire. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, and we will do questions as we go through. So if anyone has got questions as we go through, because there's lots of different countries that Claire's visited, so do either use the raise your hand function or type them in the chat. And obviously, if you use the raise a hand, I'll invite you to unmute yourself and ask the questions to Claire. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Katie. Right, I will just share my screen. You can let me know that it's all working, Katie.
Yeah, no, will do.
You're probably seeing my cows at the moment. Hold on.
Yeah.
How is that looking?
That's all perfect.
Amazing. Well, Katie, thank you so much for your kind introduction, and it's really great to be involved and to be able to share some of my findings over the last couple of years. I'm not sure if everyone in the audience knows about the Nuffield Farming Programme. I'm sure quite a lot of you do already. But basically 2 years ago, I, among with 18 other scholars from the UK, set off around the world to study a topic which we were passionate about and we thought could really improve something in either agriculture more widely or our own businesses moving forward. And mine was very much the former. So that's what the Nuffield programme is. It's about it's like a leadership journey, a research journey, and bringing back ideas that can sort of stimulate new ways of thinking and discussion. So it's a really amazing programme. And this is a very cool night for me to be presenting because I actually delivered my findings for the first time only a week ago. So, and that was a 12-minute presentation. So you're getting a lot more information this evening. But Katie has kindly said that she is going to take questions during it because I'm aware I've done a lot. There's a lot of countries. You'll have lots of questions. So don't shy away. I'm used to difficult questions. Is that not moving?
It has just moved on now. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so Katie's already said I was born in a small beef farm in Ayr, and we've got belted Galloway cattle. But for me, I've been working in the media for around a decade now. Started off at the BBC, non-farming journalism, kind of came off my sort of politics background at university. But I left the BBC around Brexit time because the BBC wasn't really covering farming issues. And I was frustrated. And I was like, this is going to have huge impact on agriculture moving forward. And I joined the national farming paper for Scotland, the Scottish Farmer, and I went on to be their political editor for the following few years. And sort of off the back of that, I ended up getting sort of roped into columns and commentating and doing a bit of TV and radio, sort of sharing ideas of what was happening in farming. And it was during that time that I was like, well, how do I start communicating to those outside farming circles? Because I did often think writing for a farming paper, I was speaking to the converted. So that was always a real passion that was burning for mine. You know, how do we better get outside those rooms and get more people interested and engaged in agriculture? But where my Nuffield farming scholarship came from was during my time as a journalist, people kept saying to me, and farmers on the ground kept saying, you know, there's a rising anti-farming agenda because climate change had really risen to the top of agendas. Food security very much seemed to take a back seat. And farming practices really were coming under the microscope. So there was this message being said to me, you know, the media are against us, the government doesn't care, the public are disconnected. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do a Nuffield farming scholarship and I'm going to travel the world and try and get a grasp on how anti-farming sentiment is changing. What are the perceptions and the expectations of agriculture around the world? And I wanted to sort of bring back this research to think how I could help wider industry, stakeholders and farmers to better engage, communicate and collaborate in the face of scrutiny. So that was the mission. I traveled to 16 countries in the last 2 years, and that's been around 9 to 10 months of travel. And I've really immersed myself in different countries, communities, cultures. And I can tell you it's been a real culture shock stepping outside of Scottish farming, let alone UK farming, and traveling in places like Africa, South America, parts of Asia, and then into Australia, New Zealand, parts of Canada, and wider Europe. It's just been really different conversations around farming. And I've had around 500 interviews and visits during that time. I think my last count was about 640. So I won't be able to remember everyone to share this evening. But this is a range of people I was speaking to, mostly farmers. But I spent time with everyone from policymakers, government ministers, to campaigners, activists, journalists, agronomists, vets, research scientists, lobbying bodies, you name it. I wanted to build up a wider picture of how people were viewing agriculture, where the kind of scrutiny was lying. And what I thought I'd do before we kick off and kind of go around the world, I'm going to take you on my first adventure, which was part of the Nuffield programme. We get sent on what's called a global focus programme. They take you out of your country, out of your reality, and they put you on a communications tour to around 4 to 6 different countries with people you don't know from around the world. And I was selected for New Zealand, Indonesia, Japan, and Australia. And that was really to say, okay, this isn't about your topic. This is about actually stepping into different farming experiences. And this is a little video for you all to see of what I got up to.
You're on mute, Claire. Claire, if you can just unmute yourself. Claire, you need to
Yeah, I don't know how it muted. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I think it just when you did the video, it muted, but that was fine. We could still see everything. It all played fine.
Great, amazing. So as you can sort of see from my video, I mean, I was coming from a beef farm in Scotland and I have never traveled and seen agriculture around the world. And I mean, that was a real sort of whirlwind of just some of the things that I saw in just 4 weeks. I mean, to see papaya and vanilla production and mangoes and coffee and avocado and bananas in Australia. And then it was prawn farming and beef feedlots when I was in Indonesia, and then matcha tea and so many other things when I was in Japan, like Wagyu production. It was a real sort of wow moment for me, just seeing the different farming systems, and really sort of that set the scene for a lot of my Nuffield, because it was about sort of being open to sort of different perspectives and different ideas. And that's kind of what I wanted to sort of share a little bit to sort of get you in the mood for my talk. If I move on to the next slide. So, okay, so I'm studying some of the scrutiny being placed on agriculture. And just to take you through a little bit of how I worked out my travels. So Brazil, you can see in the bottom hand, right hand of your screen there, was a real focus for my travels. Deforestation, there's a lot of negativity around deforestation. And I wanted to understand, we see the kind of often the Western view of it, that, 1 million hectares are deforested annually, a big figure, a concerning figure. But then I wanted to know, there must be a different story. There has to be the progress, because we're often fed the one narrative. So when I was in Brazil, it was about trying to understand, what progress have Brazilian beef farmers made within that, but also to speak to some of the activists and those that were looking at deforestation and quite critical of agriculture. And then I went to, you can see cotton farming there in Australia. Over the past 30 years, Australian cotton has completely transformed its reputation. They've gone from having no social license in their local community. There's been issues around water use, over pesticide and spraying on their crop. And it was just, for me, that was so interesting, because they've made massive progress in not only reducing the sprayings that they're doing, but really building their sort of social license within that community and turning around the anti-farming agenda. So that was a really interesting conversation to have. Then I went to places you can probably spot in Argentina. You can see some of the caps there for Argentina. I went to the Netherlands. I went to New Zealand. These are 3 countries that have recently had governments that are very, well, their policies have been quite anti-farming. They've threatened the viability of farming in those countries. So I wanted to understand and meet with policymakers, meet with lobbying bodies, and understand why those governments were creating really negative policies against agriculture. I went to places like Kenya. We import 90% of our cut flowers into the UK, and there's a lot of negativity often surrounding that industry. So it was really interesting to deep dive into Kenya, their growing systems, their soils, and to just have those sort of wider conversations with what supermarkets are doing, why we're importing flowers. And then you can see in the middle, I was at a feedlot in Brazil. And this is one of many feedlots that I visited, from Japan to Indonesia to Australia. Feedlots were a big part of my topic, because they're often at the receiving end of criticism, whether it's around animal welfare or around the environment. So it was really interesting to find out in these countries the kind of the wider perspectives around feedlots, because when we often criticize feedlots, we're doing it from a view potentially around welfare or the environment. But sitting in a feedlot in Indonesia and seeing the kind of wider spread poverty and the amount of sort of opportunities it gives of local employment, and also looking at the issues they have around red meat consumption and the lack of distribution, and how critical these feedlots were to really tackling malnourishment. So feedlots really, I changed my perspective a lot on feedlots as I traveled. Now, bottom 2 photos are around water. I'm from Scotland. I know there's a lot of people from Northern Ireland and all over the UK on the call. Water for us often is a problem around flooding and issues like that. Everywhere I travelled, the issues were around things like drought, access to water, waste of water. And the bottom left there, that was a sisal operation in Tanzania. So sisal is a fiber that's often, you'll know the sisal plant for tequila. And they were talking about how they used this machine called a decodicator to really, it was to remove these fibers to be able to create products. But 97% of it was wasted, and the water was wasted. So conversations about there and kind of water waste, and similar when I was in Australia, they come off the back of a 3-year drought. Access to water is incredibly a difficult and contentious conversation. So just looking at some of those conversations are really interesting. But I could go on and on in some of my lists, but more widely, it was very clear to me that around the world, farming is collectively coming under fire, scrutiny, whatever word you want to use. It's under the microscope. Governments in the last few years are really accelerating their commitments to climate action. And we've seen that, and there's lots of questions being asked around animal welfare, overproduction and consumption of meat, labour, access to water, all these sort of questions being asked, the degradation of soils. And then as a result of that, we've seen the sort of path being paved for noisy minority groups. You can see in the middle there's been definitely the rise of the sort of anti-farming movement with animal activists. I saw that a lot in the places that I went to. I saw the devastation some activists had on different communities. And also some of the policies. I mentioned earlier I'd been in the Netherlands. I mean, the Netherlands in the last few years, the past government was tabling a policy that was going to buy out dairy farms, and it was going to remove the license for certain dairy farms to operate. And this had caused widespread upset and just real fear amongst the dairy farming community. And I met with milk processors when I was there, I met with dairy farmers, and they were saying, you know, even though this hasn't been passed through legislation, the fact it was even a conversation that they were going to remove farmers' right to farm, like there's around 10 to 15% loss of dairy farmers expected within the next 12 months because of the uncertainty, because of the concern. So these are some of the conversations I was having. And part of the problem, and I can see this as a journalist, is that misinformation is being spread by the media. And because nowadays for journalism, it's a really competitive space to be heard. Often we're going for grabbing headlines. We're not showing the nuance. And I guess an example of this, some of you will have watched this a few years ago, this documentary that came out. It's emotive. It gets people thinking. And this is sort of the type of content that I'm really desperate to sort of turn.
It's their problem. It's my problem. It's your problem.
Seeing that and understanding the scale just sets me off.
Should we just stop eating meat? Meat, Threat to Our Planet on BBC One and iPlayer.
Content like that is something I personally have been seeing everywhere, and I'm sure you have as well. And when you sort of all these compounding issues together, the sort of media vilification, the policies that are coming in, the sort of noisy groups that are getting louder, and the government's really sort of accelerating their agendas where farming is kind of falling into the kind of microscope, you understand why farmers are taking to the streets. I mean, this is a photo only from last week. I'm sure some of you might have been there. You saw the protests that were happening in London. I've seen protests and been following them around the world. I've actually been quite critical of protests in general, but I think last week really impressed me because I think it was quite concise in its messaging. And I think the fact that they took to the streets on foot, and I'm sure that's something, you know, questions will come in about that at the end anyway, but I think that was a more positive example of a protest than what I've seen. But ultimately, the fact that farmers are having to take to the streets and protest is very, very worrying. And then I thought to myself, gosh, this is all a lot of negativity. And I got into quite a negative space where all I was hearing was problems and problems and issues. And then I thought to myself, if I come back from this Nuffield and all I do is share presentations with the content I've just shared with you all, and I talk about the negatives and I talk about the scrutiny being placed on agriculture, what does that really deliver? What does that deliver in terms of solutions and answers? So I changed tact slightly and I started thinking, okay, how is agriculture responding to scrutiny? I knew it wasn't going to be good, the answer, but I thought if we can understand how it's responding, then we can think about how can we move forward and actually think about how we can better communicate and advocate moving forward. So I posed this question to almost 600 people that I met, and this is what they said. This is very hard to read, and if I'm honest, it was totally expected because of all the factors that I've listed above. I mean, farming has become reactive and defensive often because it's been pushed into that position. There is fragmentation in our messaging. There are so many silos happening within different industry bodies, within conversations. There's blame being pointed between different sectors. The regenerative agricultural sectors pointing the blame at the more conventional systems. And I really saw everywhere this sort of polarization and a lot of this was fueled by this kind of echo chamber that I saw agriculture sort of existing in. So I thought, okay, this is a sort of problem that we've got ourselves into within agriculture. We can't change the other pressures coming down the line. We can't change maybe the minority groups that are being loud. We can do a bit about the media, but we know the policy direction is going to increasingly be farming under scrutiny. But what we can do is we can change how we respond to scrutiny. And that's when I moved forward and I thought we need to seek out the positives. I need to find the examples of people that are doing things really, really positively because we all get stuck in the negative. I think we're naturally programmed to seek out negativity. Some of you might have met this gentleman here, Mark Gascoigne. He's a New Zealand dairy farmer who came over to Scotland about a couple of years ago now as part of the Farmstrong, the wellbeing movement. And I met Mark and I went and visited him in New Zealand during my travels. And he said a phrase to me that has just been so important for me to hear. And that was, why do we choose to step in dog shit when we can choose to step around it? You can apply that to almost anything. So I applied it to social media. You know, I put up a post about deforestation in Brazil and, you know, farmers' role in that. And all, you know, I see lots of negative comments, but I miss all the positive ones around it because all I do is I get dragged into the negative. And I think that is something that is widely applied to agriculture more widely. Because if you step away from that, and I did in every country I visited, I looked at reports and surveys, and farming kept coming out as being one of the most trusted and respected professions by the public. But if all you see is the noise, you lose sight of that. And that was something I think is really important to remember, is that when we go back to farming in our own communities and we're talking amongst our echo chambers, we sort of perpetuate some of the scrutiny being placed. But actually, I think sometimes we need to remember it's not as bad as we think. And I think this point again, just to highlight it again, we can't always change the way others treat us, but we can change the way we react. And that is what agriculture, I believe, can do moving forward, is change the way we react to scrutiny. So now I'm going to show you a quick video because you've heard enough of my voice for a bit. And I'm going to take you on a deep dive into some of my other world travels, into Africa, parts of Europe, South America, and New Zealand again, and just to see a little bit about some of the really inspiring and exciting things I got to see.
And there's a place that I've dreamed of, where I can find my. I hear the sounds of the season and lose all sense of time. I'm looking far away to a sunny place where it's just you and me. Feels like we're in a dream. You know what I mean. On everybody's side, the way it feels so long. By the birds in the night sky, but won't keep us young, keep us young. And we will leave by the ocean. Our hearts will move with the tide. And we will wake in the morning. Satisfied.
So that gives you a bit of an idea of some of the other travels that I got to do. And right at the start of that video, you'll have seen clips from my time in Africa. And I've been to so many places, and I can only really narrow down some of the examples of places I've been. And I think the reason I want to focus on Africa is because in general, most people who do an full scholarship, they go to New Zealand, they go to Australia, they go to America, and they go to parts of Europe. But I don't often think developing countries get as much of a look in. And I actually think it was during my time in Africa that I was the most inspired. I was probably the most hopeful. And it made me think about sometimes the simplicity of the conversations that I had just were so far ahead of some of the things I think we could actually be doing here. So this is where I would say I began to get really, really excited and hopeful about some of the sort of solutions to some of the anti-farming sentiment. So this remarkable woman that I met in Zimbabwe is a lady called Ruva Chiramuta. Now she is a young storyteller in a country which, one, is incredibly dangerous to be a journalist, and two, has a very negative legacy surrounding its agricultural industry. And she was so frustrated when I went out there that there has been such negativity constantly painted at Zimbabwe, negativity I'm sure all of us are quite aware of. And she decided 4 years ago to launch an online magazine, which you can see in the top left there, Zim Agric Chronicle, and it was all about sharing positive stories. This is a really unusual concept for a journalist in general, But what she did was she totally changed the tone of discussion, and she started sharing really positive updates on some of the innovations that were happening in Zimbabwe and wider Africa. She started inspiring new ways of sort of ideas and thinking. And for her, it was about how do we get the next generation of young people to pursue a future in farming? Because Africa, like here in the UK and other parts that I travelled, young people aren't coming back to the farm. And a lot of that is because of the constant negativity. So Ruva, seeing this, thought, right, I need to start showing young people that this is a really exciting, positive place to be part of. And she's gone on to be one of the best known journalists, not just in Zimbabwe, but across Africa, because she takes such a uniquely positive view of this. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, you wish our journalists here were like this, but she's quite a remarkable person that has really gone against the odds. When I was in Tanzania, I spent a lot of time with the Maasai community. Now, many of you might know about the Maasai community. So they are nomadic people in Tanzania and parts of Kenya who tend to accumulate large herds of cattle. And these cattle often don't enter the food chain, um, which I'm sure you're all thinking is massively inefficient. But these herds are getting bigger and bigger. Food supply and access to pasture is getting, increasingly difficult, and they're moving constantly in search of water and pasture, and it's leading to massive issues around soil degradation, also leading to real conflict with wildlife and conservation in certain areas and national parks that I visited. And I met this man in the bottom left-hand corner, and his Miyasi Molo and his mother Martha. And Miyasi was doing something really fascinating. He had left the community seeing lots of the problems that were happening, and he trained up in regenerative agriculture. Now, I wasn't really interested in the regenerative element of what he was doing. It was more the way he was communicating it that I was particularly fascinated in. And he understood that he'd left his Maasai community and he no longer fitted in. He'd become educated and people no longer wanted to hear from him. He wasn't boots on the ground anymore. So he enlisted his mum, Martha, who was right at the heart of her community, and he showed and demonstrated to her the positives that regen could offer to the Maasai community around their soils. And she saw the benefits of this, and together they've set up a demonstration farm and are creating workshops, training up women from local Maasai communities. And those women are then going on and spreading those stories and ideas amongst their own communities. And it's very much what I took from this. It was working alongside, not preaching the benefits of a system. And I remember him saying to me, and you'll see the quote on the screen, if you want to talk to a fish, send a fish and not a snake. And it really got me thinking about who we trust as our advisors and who speaks to us. And I just thought he'd really carefully considered how he could create change by working from within. And what I've done here is I've included a very short video for you, only about 20 seconds, of an extraordinary day. One of the best parts of my entire experience. I was traveling through the Kilimanjaro region of Tanzania in search of some of the local Maasai. And we were told there was a watering hole which they gathered in the afternoon before the sunset, and they would take their cattle from different communities to the water to drink. But what we didn't know was that in the background, there was a herd of elephants who were watching these cattle coming to these water holes to drink. And I was there with a couple of gentlemen who said that they'd been living in Tanzania for 7 years and they had never seen an example of like coexistence between people, livestock, and wildlife. So it was really quite an amazing thing for me to witness. And I think it gives you a bit of an understanding too of the Maasai way of life and what it looks like. And I thought some of you might like to see that. It's very emotional for me to watch, which is lovely looking back at this. So moving on to another country in Africa that I visited, and this is a slightly different conversation, and this happened in Kenya. I visited one of the biggest farming operations over there called Kukuzi Farms. Now they're a 14,000 hectare farming commercial forestry operation in Thika, which is about a couple of hours from the capital city of Nairobi. And during COVID, a scandal hit their farming operation. They got embroiled in a human rights abuse scandal. There was over 200 allegations made against their business. And they ended up, supermarkets revoked their contracts, and their reputation was pretty much almost in ruin. In the months that followed, because they put various sort of transparency procedures into place, they were able to uncover that this had been part of a bit of a scam to really discredit their reputation, because a lot of people were trying to divide larger farming operations into smaller parcels of land. And it was found this had been, false accusations, and they'd been bribed lots of money. But the problem here is that the damage had already been done to their reputation. So what was interesting for me and why I visited was, how did they come back from something? How did they come back from such, not just scrutiny, but completely a reputational disaster? What they did moving forward was they set up a complete transparency approach. So for Africa, for context, you will never have on a farming operation there a perfect record. There will always be misdemeanors and accidents and issues happening in these farms. I mean, this one in itself had 3,000 employees working on the farm. But what they decided to do was to document and publish on their website every single incident happening within that community on the farm, and then backed it up with an action plan of what they were doing moving forward. And slowly but surely, yes, it was challenging because they didn't have a perfect record and some supermarkets were shy. But what they did do was build integrity and trust. And over the last couple of years, all those supermarkets have come back on board. Everybody now holds up Kukuzi as an example of somebody that's done something so innovative and different and honest to build that trust and connection again. And for me, it was really an example of, if they put the stories out there and they show what they're doing to take accountability, they control the narrative. So the media can't get in there and write their story for them. So I thought that was a real learning for me, was how do you actually put something out there like that to really control the narrative? But as I've been traveling, everyone kept saying to me, where in the world does it best? Where in the world is the most positive at storytelling, at combating some of this negativity? And I would say, well, it's not a country, but it's a sector. And I truly believe that agritourism has been one of the most amazing opportunities and gifts for agriculture to share its story and to build those connection points and that trust with communities who are growing increasingly disconnected from agriculture because those immersive stays on farm. And not everybody is going to be suited to agritourism, and that's okay. And I'm never going to tell everybody to do agritourism. My goodness, the idea of my family doing agritourism, it would never work. But what some of these organisations do is they give a community service to all of us. We all benefit from the efforts that they make. So I was really excited learning and visiting agritourism opportunities from Tasmania to Tanzania, but really in Scotland, collectively, I was so impressed by the sense of collaboration and unity and between all the different organisations. And a lot of that is due to really good leadership under the sector lead, Caroline Miller. And I think they've really, inspired so many people. And that reputation is global. And earlier you met Ruva Chiramuta from Zimbabwe. Well, the reputation of Scottish agritourism has made it to the fields of Africa, to the fields of Zimbabwe, because she told me that she has subscribed to their monthly newsletter, and she is now using the learnings from Scottish agritourism to help farmers in Zimbabwe set up their own businesses. So that was a really beautiful moment to see that happening. I quickly had to show you another favourite visit of mine. A visit that I didn't expect to be part of my research. I'm just a massive Hobbit and Lord of the Rings fan, but I was in North Island of New Zealand, and Mark Gascoigne from earlier, the dairy farmer, he treated me for my Christmas with a visit to Hobbiton. And as I arrived, I was absolutely gobsmacked that it turned out to be a massive agritourism operation, because the Alexander family, they're a working sheep farm. They are still very much, firstly, farmers, and secondly, they're hosting one of the biggest movie sets in the world. And I found out that they have over 500,000 visitors every single year. So I set off with about 40 other visitors from different countries, all very excited to see the Hobbit holes. And the first thing that happened is a video came on the bus saying about, let's take a moment to thank the farmers who's made this possible, talked about their custodianship of the land, talked about the support they had for the natural environment and food production, and everyone had to really sort of celebrate agriculture. And I thought, oh my goodness, what an absolute amazing opportunity. Who would have thought, the fantasy world of J.R.R. Tolkien would end up being a real gift and a real marketing PR campaign for agriculture. So I just had to share that because that was a real shock for me when I came across the agritourism experience in Hobbiton. Now, another way that I've definitely seen around really responding to scrutiny in a positive way has been the power of storytelling. So, I mean, love him or loathe him, Jeremy Clarkson of Clarkson's Farm has done so much for our industry around the world. I don't think I've traveled to one country where they don't mention Clarkson's Farm and Caleb and the wider team. He's done so much around building those connection points between wider outside agriculture as well as within agriculture. And I think he's provided a masterclass on how to communicate very simply and make it very accessible in order to connect. So I think he's done a huge amount of good for the industry in that sense. But the storytellers are endless all around the world. I mean, the top right-hand corner there, a really good friend of mine, Anna Carolina Zimmerman. She's a beef farmer. She's 2,000 head of Nelore cattle in the center of Brazil. She is fed up of the anti-farming deforestation narrative facing her sector. So she's now ended up becoming a bit of an influencer, a bit of a storyteller, and she travels to the FAO, she meets the policymakers, and she shares the other side of Brazilian agriculture. She accepts the problem, but she's really changed the narrative and tackling misinformation. Next to her, you have Professor Frank Mitloehner. Now, he is a scientist and a communicator. Many of you might know him being involved in the livestock industry. He set up the Clear Center at UC Davis in California, and it's purely targeting misinformation in the livestock industry. And he makes it really accessible, really engaging. He's really creative, and he really challenges you how to think about how you're communicating. So he's been a brilliant person to speak to. Ruva, again, of course, I had to include her again because she's been one of the most inspiring people I've met. And then the top left, you've got Ollie Lalive. He's one of the top podcasters in Australia. He has the Humans of Agriculture podcast, and he is really determined to get young people excited about Australian agriculture. And he speaks to really inspiring people and asks them about their career pathways and how it made it work for them. And he's got a huge listenership, and it's not just within agriculture. He's managed to connect with so many people through social media around Australia. And then bottom left, that was when I recently was on the Fed by Farmers podcast with Cami Wilson and Iona Murray, who do the brilliant Fed by Farmers podcast. And Cami, of course, is the well-known face of the sheep game, and he is known everywhere around the world because he's entertaining, because he's light, and he's really a fantastic way of storytelling to connect. So all of these individuals, plus many more that I visited, really have that powerful way of storytelling to build connection. But it's also going to start from young people. It's going to be, everyone keeps saying to me, should we be getting farming into the curriculum? Should we be doing a degree in agriculture? What have you seen around the world? The best youth educational programme that I have seen in my travels was in Northern Ireland. And I was very lucky that I was involved just a few weeks ago. I was in Belfast and I got to host the ABP Angus Youth Challenge. And I was absolutely blown away by this programme. A year programme directed at 14-year-old pupils, open to all students across Northern Ireland. And they basically have to come up with a project looking at sort of sustainability within food and farming in Northern Ireland. And as part of their year-long project, the finalists, they get given Angus cross calves to rear and they keep the proceeds. They're given everything from communications training, support for farm events. And the finalists this year that I was lucky enough to speak to, they'd created podcasts, they had organised agricultural clubs within their schools, and they've really had so many touch points throughout the industry. And I mean, I'm talking thousands of pupils are all talking about agriculture, but in a way that isn't just on the curriculum, it's about business, it's about practical skills. And I just thought this was such an amazing way, it's such a critical time in their kind of educational journey to be doing something really, really inspiring. So I've given you a few examples, and there are so many more. I want to sort of briefly touch on some of the learnings from these examples and other ones that I've been to. And I think a glowing one for me is this sort of opportunity to engage. And that's how I see scrutiny. Scrutiny is not something to be shying away from, but it's about how do we respond by engaging to that scrutiny. And things like agritourism earlier, things like, the Highland Show, things like the Yorkshire Show, in FaceTime a Farmer, different initiatives where you're inviting people in and welcoming them into the gates of the industry, the gates behind your farm. And I guess my caveat there being there's a term that's often used within the farming industry that we need to ban, and that is we need to educate the public. And one thing I need to take away from today that you're going to change the way you say that term. Say we need to engage with, not educate the public, because engagement is a two-way street. Education can be quite entitled, it can be quite patronizing. We've got to show interest and engagement outside as well. And I think being a journalist that's worked for farming papers, I am just as guilty of my middle point there around we need to stop trying to convince farmers to love farmers. We need to start convincing those outside farming. Who are we speaking to? Who's in the room? And I often go to conferences now. I host a lot of conferences, and I always ask the organisers who's not in the room, because they're probably the people I want to speak to. And I think that's always a really important thing, is to look around you and think who's not hearing what I have to say and how do we get to them. And I think this point here, and I'm going to echo it a couple of points later down the line as well, that often in agriculture, we tend to respond to a crisis. But the main thing that we need to be thinking about is we've got to start building relationships before crises occur. So the famous Henry Kissinger quote, he's a former US Secretary of the US, deeds done in peacetime are always better than money spent in war. And it is so true. The investments that we can do in building those networks now and building that Northern Ireland network of the ABP Angus Youth Challenge, building our storytelling, building our connection to agritourism and communication, doing that now, you have an army of people to call on when things get tough down the road. And that is something I'm always thinking about. What is the kind of longer term approach to what we're doing? And there we go again. What's that playing the long-term game? It all sort of flows into each other here. Agriculture is long-term. You're choosing genetics for your cattle, which are going to serve you sort of 5, 10, further years down the line. You're choosing seeds or different varieties of crops. Again, it's all about that long-term game. However, agriculture has got very sucked into the short term because politics is short term. And because we've been subsidised for a long time, of course, we're responding to where the policy and where government is moving. But what I would really like to sort of push on you all today is that these 4 pictures in here, so that's Argentina on the left, New Zealand on the right, that's the UK at the bottom right, and then Netherlands in the bottom left. All 4 of these countries have changed governments in the last year and a half when I visited. And all of them, are changing in terms of their relationship with agriculture. And we've got to be prepared for those changes. We've got to be thinking ahead, who's coming in, who's the opposition, how can we get different people responding? And I'm sure you're all thinking the Labour government have just come in and they've really upset everybody in farming. And my question to that would be, how have we really built that connection with Labour over the last 10, 11 years, 12 years? Have we made sure that when Labour comes in, that they are absolutely understanding who to go to consult with when they're creating the budget? Do they have that army of support and knowledge and relationships? So I think that's really, really important to think about those kind of global political shifts, but also thinking just more widely, how do I build that army of support? Again, I put that in bold there because I think that's really, really important. And I think really just drawing on that example of what's happened in the UK recently, we can't let the current frustrations become a roadblock for future engagement. Everyone's now going to say, well, there's no point speaking to government. They don't care. We can't do that. We can't afford to. We've got to be able to move on and take the high road on that. I think it's really important to constantly be thinking that longer term. I'm going to say this because I'm a journalist, but I think it's so, so important. We need to start thinking about connecting with media outside farming circles. And we've also got to think about how do we speak to the media when it's not just in crisis, because everywhere has been on the news recently. It's been on Sky News, it's been on, it's been over Channel 4, BBC, everyone's covering the protests. When has agriculture had so much coverage? It's because it's a crisis. And that really worries me because they're telling our story in times of crisis, whereas if we can be more proactive as opposed to reactive, we can make sure that we're going to the media in times of, a bit like the Henry Kissinger quote, in times of peacetime, not just in times of war. So it's about how do we use the media as a marketing resource. And sometimes I do media training workshops with farmers and different organizations. And I always say, start using the media as a tool. It's free and you can get to so many people, and you can't underestimate the power of that person who's writing the story, who's sharing the podcast. I mean, I'm a columnist. I get to write my opinions on things and I get to write to thousands of people. Those are thousands of people that are going to cast a vote, and politicians care about their voters. So think about that step to government. If you can really befriend and tap into the media, it can be a really powerful tool. And lastly, building community and collaboration within agriculture. It's been a real challenge of mine, and I guess one of my real passion projects traveling around the world is this idea of the blame game, and it's happening really badly within agriculture, whether it's between countries, it's between practices, between communities. Everybody is sort of in the face of scrutiny, they're pointing the finger, and I've seen it in documentaries, I've been to regenerative farming festivals, and I've been appalled by the negative language that's being used at those who aren't regen. And for me, that is such a difficult and terrible way to be moving, is to be condemning others, because that's never going to create change. And I think, I don't know if any of you have heard of the term tall poppy syndrome, and it's the idea that when a business or an organization starts to really be innovative or be successful or really sort of rise above the rest, that kind of tall poppy, people pull them down, their local community draws them down. It could be, for example, someone encourages you to put yourself forward for an award or a competition, but you say, no, I couldn't do that because what would others say? And that is often the tall poppy syndrome that's really holding farming back, because we need to be proud. It goes back to my chat with Ruva again. If you want young people to work in the sector, we need to start reinstating pride and getting people to be excited about working in it. And then we're also operating in silos constantly. We're a bit better in the UK, but parts of Australia, I mean, I arrived there and found out they had 270 advocacy bodies, 270 bodies working on behalf of agriculture, and they wondered why they weren't getting cut through with government, because they weren't concise in their messaging, because they were divided. And that's a real concern that I'm seeing. We're duplicating our efforts, and because we're so divided, the government can just step aside and say, well, while they're divided, we're just not going to listen, we're not going to engage. And it's an excuse for government, but we're allowing them that excuse. So it's something I've seen quite a lot. This is the final video I'm going to play you very quickly, and it's a documentary that has just been created by Alltech. Over the last 3 years, they have sent 2 filmmakers around the world to ask the question, what would a world look like without cows? And it's the first documentary that I've been very lucky to see one of the early screenings of this, and hopefully you will all get to see that in the coming months. But it's one of the only documentaries that I've seen that brings in all of these things in terms of, they talk about nuance. They look at the wider stories around agriculture. They have regen, they have feedlot farming. They bring everything in, and everything has its place. Everything is, a positive conversation. And I just think it's a really exciting opportunity to show people the value of cattle and to show you the value and how that changes in different parts of the world.
The fabric of nature hangs in the balance because our planet is under threat, and young creature is at the center of it all.
Every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. We have had the mantra pounded into us, you got to produce more, you got to feed the world. If we keep eating animal products on this scale, climate change continues to be exacerbated.
Many people would say cows are the worst thing in the world for the climate.
People say, let's just get rid of livestock and grow crops instead. That's not possible.
We're really missing the bigger picture.
In a world without cows, we may be giving up one of our best tools to help heal the planet.
If we want to truly mitigate climate change, we need animals on the landscape. How do we pull that carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soil? That's where livestock come in. Agriculture holds the key to saving our planet.
What really happens if you take all the cows away?
Are we better off in a world without cows?
I hope you all enjoyed watching that trailer. It's a fantastic documentary. It's about an hour and a half. And what it did was it broached the question of cattle and their role not only in feeding the world or feeding people, but also around the importance of culture and heritage and politics and the environment. And it was a really beautiful documentary, and I just think that gave me a lot of hope as well, that we're going to be starting to create a movement to have these more nuanced and balanced conversations. But I realize I'm speaking for such a long time, so I will just come on to my sort of conclusions. And I put my recommendations here because this was as part of my Nuffield research. I have my recommendations. So I wanted to sort of share what I've come up with as my sort of 5 steps moving forward. And it is really an amalgamation of lots of the things I've just shared with you, but I call them the 5 C's. And it's about curiosity, being curious, stepping outside our echo chambers in order to engage. It's about rethinking not just the way we communicate, but our language that we use and making it accessible, the way we communicate. We talk about building our social license to operate. Well, my question has got to be about conscience, social license to operate, and then building transparency. We've got to think about opening up what we do, bringing people in, building trust if we want to be able to really connect outside our farming circles. And the whole theme throughout all of this is how can we do this in collaboration? How do we work not in silos but in harmony? And how do we work with those multiple stakeholders to amplify and strengthen the voice of agriculture? And for me, my journey has been absolute madness over the last sort of 2 years, and there's so much more I could share, and there's many more things I can say. And because I presented my findings last week, it doesn't end there. So in case any of you are wondering, like moving forward, I'm front and foremost a storyteller, and I will continue to tell agricultural stories, and I'll question, perspectives and ideas and criticisms put at agriculture. But off the back of my research, I wanted to do something that was quite practical. So I have set up my own consultancy company, Advocacy Consulting, and I'm really excited about that because I want to think about how do we amplify agriculture's voice, and that has got to be around, improving our kind of media and advocacy and engagement strategies. I'm really excited that I'm going to be based in Australia and the UK, between the two, and working with businesses and farmers and organisations all over the world, looking at how we can sort of strengthen the voice in the face of scrutiny. But thank you all very, very much. I put my details on there if anyone wants to reach out or get in contact at another time. But yeah, thank you so much for hearing a little bit about my journey. And I'll stop sharing now, Katie.
Thank you very much, Claire. We have Crosby has got his hand up. So if you want to unmute yourself, Crosby, and ask your question.
Okay, wow. Claire, don't ever slow down. Do not slow down. I feel like I've been around the world half a dozen times there. The one comment at the very beginning, you were talking about the governments around the world, some of them going very negative towards farming. Have you a common denominator there that made them go negative towards farming? Was there something that started all that?
I think it has to be the Paris Agreement. I think it's got to be the pressure that's happening off the back of all the COPs about how we can reduce global warming. And everyone's making commitments around deforestation, around sort of reducing our use of fossil fuels. Everybody's being pushed very much to sort of accelerate those action points. And I think that is what's really led to it. And that's the thing. I mean, when I started as a journalist, when I talked at conferences, it was about, improving yields, it was about improving production. And suddenly all we talked about was climate change, which isn't good because there's so many other factors as well. But that is what appears that all governments really that I came across when it came to agriculture, that was the conversation. Paul.
Yeah, just unmute yourself, Paul.
Yes, thanks very much, Claire, for that presentation. There's 2 things, I suppose. Given the number of farmers there is in the UK and the size of our farming union organisations, also Farmers Union in Northern Ireland and the Farmers Union in the UK, I often thought that the Farmers Union need a PR machine to get all our good news stories out there. We're always on the back foot trying to react to all that the government's throwing at us. And I always thought that we need a good PR machine out there to get our good news stories out. Another thing, and people always laughed at me when I said this, but I think that as an organisation, given the numbers we have, farmers and those working in the industry, we should be sponsoring the Six Nations, or we should be sponsoring, the European Championship, because you look at many rugby players there is coming off the farms, and people laugh at me when I say this, but Guinness sponsor the Six Nations, their household name, and they get their message out there. I mean, as an organisation, I can't see why, British farmers can't be sponsoring, our national rugby teams, or they can't be, as an organisation, and using a vehicle like that to connect with the community and get our message out there.
I mean, sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire, for the presentation.
Well, Paul, I agree with you. I mean, everything you said, because one of my frustrations that I didn't share at the start was I just felt the unions kept putting out negative content. And as a journalist, I was just getting my inbox full every single week of, this is happening with the government and this is what we need to do. And I was like, everything is reactive. Nothing is proactive. There's plenty of storytellers and influencers and, filling the space of there is. But you need something that's orchestrated. You need something that's going to have cut through and speak directly to government. And there's got to be lobbying bodies doing that. And I did see what you're saying there around Guinness and Six Nations. In New Zealand, they've got really good at that. So they've teamed up with the All Blacks, and they're really sort of using the All Blacks around some of their dairy adverts. And they've really there's been a massive change in the conversation. And I think health is one of the most amazing examples that you've highlighted that we can move into. When I delivered my presentation last week, I was actually on the panel and it was about health, community and communication. And we had 2 doctors in the panel that were presenting their findings, and they were talking about I think it was something like 97, what was it? So like diet-related illnesses were contributing to 97 billion or something. I mean, it was a crazy figure. And they were saying, why is that not an opportunity to be directly linking food to actually healthy living? And I think there's so much more crossover when it comes to working with doctors, when it working with sports teams. I think we could get a lot more inventive, a lot more creative to start thinking about having those conversations early.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Has anybody else got any questions? If you have, please put your hand up or type them in the chat. Claire, I've got a question for you. When do you think farmers will need to change?
Yesterday. The thing is, we all need to change. It's not just farming. I think it's everybody. But I think change is being forced on farmers quite quickly. And this is where it's hard. And that's why when I talk about change, and a lot of my work is around changing mindsets, and Miyasi's work in Tanzania was around how do you change mindsets. I think the problem that we've got ourselves into is that we're forcing change in farming very quickly without consultation and not allowing farmers to be part of the journey. And it's been very much shoes on the carpet, telling boots on the ground what to do. Because there's been times where I've had government policymakers reach out to me and say, you go to conferences and you speak to farmers and they're positive with you. Why are they not positive with us? And I said, well, it's because I'm on the ground listening and I'm engaging. And I might not be out working on the farm because I've been traveling a lot, but you need to start being in that listening position if you expect there to be change and for people to want to walk alongside with you. So I think, unfortunately, farming probably does need to be more receptive to change. You've got to be more willing that when we talk about it, and we've got to be more willing to do that, but we're only going to do that if people don't force it on us and they walk alongside us. So that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Nigel, you just need to unmute.
Sorry.
That's right.
Good evening. No, I have so many questions to make. I don't quite know where to start, really.
That's good, though. It's great that it's enthused you, Nigel.
Yeah, well, I mean, I take an active interest in a few affairs, and I get it's very difficult when, particularly living in Wales, when you get the perception that the government is very definitely anti-farmer. In Wales, they do things to make life difficult for farmers. Mm-hmm. And I can give you numerous examples of that. They would deny it. I'm going to give them the right to deny it, but from my perspective, they certainly do. That's a big hurdle to overcome. How do you do that?
Yeah, and it's a question, Nigel. It's a good question. I'm asked it all the time. You'll like and not like my answer, but it's one of my points earlier around the kind of long-term game. So currently there is real concern, whether it's in Wales or whether it's down south, about the reaction of the government and whether they're anti-farming or not. And I think a lot of that has been over the years. There's been a lack of many things, a lack of engagement with those parties to really care and really value farming. Part of that, I think, is because farming has operated in the background quite quietly for a long time. And I don't think we've been as vocal and really showcasing why farming really, really matters. Normally, we only showcase ourselves when there's a problem. We're not actually making ourselves indispensable and why we're valuing it. So I think there's a problem. And even if suddenly everything changes and we all get out there in the front foot and we start saying, you know, we're really proud of our industry and there's lots of positives, it will take time to sort of, you know, to sow the seed and for it to grow. And we don't have as many politicians in Parliament that come from a farming background, that understand, that have worked in farming and that care. So I do think there's probably something within farming. How do we start really, you know, nurturing people to actually start being our butts on the benches, actually representing us in Parliament? So we've got those friendly voices in the inside who are doing that. But I think it's going to take a long time, but I think farming almost needs a complete transformation in its communication and advocacy strategies. We've got to be thinking, are we actually engaging a lot more proactively around farming, getting creative about why the role of farming? Stop talking about farming, talk about food. Every single politician cares about food because, I mean, why has there been subsidies for so many years? To keep food cheap. And that's the thing. Everyone always says, oh, farmers are subsidized. And I always say to them, well, do you want cheap food? Do you want to access cheap food? That is why a lot of farmers would remove the subsidies if they were paid for what they produce. So if we change the conversation around food a lot more, which I think the protest recently has actually done a lot, they've started to really change that conversation. But I think it's all these incremental changes, whether it's, you know, in schools, having those touch points, nurturing, you know, future policymakers. It's about having those early engagements. So it's not really an answer what we can change tomorrow, Nigel, but I think it's something we can collectively do a lot better moving forward. Labour will not be in for a long time. It's like I said, political cycles are going to change. They're going to move on. And that's the thing. Farming has outlived every single government for, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think that gives us hope. But we've got to constantly be thinking about the next decade, the next multiple decades to actually put the work in.
Yeah, I don't think it's only politicians. The politicians are, to quote Sir Humphrey Appleby, the PR department of the civil service, and it's I got to be careful what I say here. Really, I get the impression that even though they may employ agricultural consultants, there's very, very few, and I would go as far to say there are no civil servants involved in the agricultural sector who actually have a background in production agriculture.
Yeah.
But there are civil servants who have a background in environmentalism. And because of, like you said about the Paris Accord, that seems to dominate thinking in government a minute about meeting what they have signed up to for climate change. And they see us as about the only way of doing it. Sorry, go on.
What I was going to say, there's still, I mean, farming isn't the only thing under the lens. It's absolutely, when you step outside, fossil fuels, you know, microplastics and fast fashion, it's still being talked about. But because of the algorithms online, we do tend to just see the farming things, which is hard. But I do think absolutely there's so much more pressure. And you're right, you do tend to have more civil servants and environmental backgrounds than agriculture. And I've questioned that. And I will tell you, when I was in New Zealand and Australia, the first of its kind, they had what are called Special Agricultural Trade Envoys, so SATE. And they had a representative that had to be a farmer on the ground, and they were the eyes and the ears of the agriculture industry, and they had a direct seat to government to update what was happening. And they went out as kind of trade envoys around the world. And I met a woman called Sue McCluskey, so she's the Special Agricultural Trade Envoy for Australia. And she is doing exactly what you're saying, Nigel. She is someone that's coming in, she's questioning, she's giving the sort of production on the ground thing. And I've never seen that before. I mean, we have attachés around the world. They're civil servants. They're not farmers working on the ground. So what they're doing in New Zealand and Australia is very new and it's very exciting. And that is somebody that has got the voice of farming, you know, is on the ground doing that. So I think there's something like that would be a great thing to have over here.
Okay,
I could go on, but I'll drop it there.
Okay, well, let Crosby ask a question.
Yes, throwing the spot, this one. Feedlots, grass-fed beef, etc. and they even go as far as zero grazing. 3 different opinions coming through there, really, from different people. What your travels around the world, what are you seeing? What's the way forward for the UK?
Okay, so that changes it. The question is for the UK. that will give a different answer. But if we go to their first question on feedlots, I mean, I come from an extensively grazed belted Galloways. They're fattened to 28, 29 months. I mean, I'm your, like, which a lot of people would say is highly inefficient, extensive grazing, grass finished, one system. And that's what I was used to. My mum's a vet. I'm always asking questions about animal welfare. And I was very much of the mindset, I'm negative about feedlots. And I went off of that sort of opinion. I totally flipped it on its head, which is what this experience did for me, because I started to question, well, actually, what purpose are these feedlots serving? So, for example, I think I talked about Indonesia earlier. I turned up and first of all, I was looking at, they had about 60,000 cattle on this feedlot operation, and they'd been brought over from Australia and they were being finished. And so they'd been extensively grazed for the first part of their life, and then they were being finished for 3 to 4 months in these feedlot systems in Indonesia. And straight away, I could easily look at it and see all the animals compacted together. And I was questioning it. I was thinking, from a welfare perspective, I was looking at their hooves. I was thinking all these things. And then I started to ask questions, and they had like vets on site, they had nutritionists on site, and these were such healthy cattle. They were very healthy cattle. They were adapted to that climate. They had the kind of twitchy skin for the flies. They had the big ears. Like, there were so many things that really impressed me that I had to ask to understand that. And then I saw that they had 800 employees working on this feedlot. 800 employees in a community of where there was such low levels of employment, and they were lifting people out of poverty. And then I took another step back, and I was like, here's me criticizing potentially animal welfare. What about human welfare? So that's where I was like, well, we don't ask the question about human welfare. We always talk about animal welfare. Both are important. But I think sometimes we lose perspective. So you've got feedlots in parts of Indonesia and parts of Brazil, which were the kind of biggest feedlots that I visited. And they are actually feeding the world. I mean, a population of Indonesia of 270 million, where they don't have access to meat. I mean, hardly at all. The government is subsidizing feedlots because they're so desperate for red meat to make it onto dinner tables. And it just totally changed its head for me. So I wasn't, yes, I was still interested in the welfare and things, but I was like, we need to feed people. And that's where you've got to think about it. I think in the UK, if we're honest about it, we're not going to feed the world. So, and you've got to have a balance of different systems. You're going to have your native breeders like me that's going to have extensive systems, but then obviously you've got your more intensive systems, which are better really for the planet. I think that's what, the science has really showed for that. And I now have come back much more open-minded to different finishing systems. They all have different outcomes and perspectives, Crosby. And I know in Brazil, for example, you'd rather have cattle in these feedlots than clearing lots of land for deforestation. So it's just instantly you're just thinking constantly about these different things. And I got a lot of criticism in Brazil because I was quite positive about their feedlots, but I thought, well, I'm going to be, because nobody else shows the side of it. And I think I said to you earlier, in Brazil, 1 million hectares are deforested annually. The figure that no one tells you is 2.5 million hectares of intensification of grazing and crop farming coming together to sort of improve their practices. That's happening every single year. No one talks about that. And that's a real positive around how they're improving their pastures, improving their farming systems, but we don't hear that story. So I think for me, it was about, I started off thinking feedlots are negative, but now it's like, it depends on the context, depends on the climate, depends on the outcome.
Well
but thank you for
explained.
asking that.
Well explained.
Thanks, Claire. Has anybody else got any other questions? Nigel, did you have any others? Because I know you had a few there. Oh, Richard, if you just unmute yourself, Richard, and then bring your question in. You're still muted, Richard. You just need to unmute yourself. Pretty sure I can't unmute you.
Is that unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted now. Perfect.
I'm unmuted, right? Yeah. No, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really great. Well, and your enthusiasm for the subject as well. But what really worries me is that we're an urban society, and the only farmer most people have ever met is Jeremy Clarkson, who has done an amazing job. I agree. food comes from Tesco, as far as most people are concerned, and Tesco source food from all over the world, wherever it's cheapest. So people feel sorry for us because we appear to be sort of fighting an uphill battle, but we're an expensive luxury that do they really feel that we're necessary unless Mr. Putin invades Europe? That's what I sort of worry about getting through. Am I losing the point?
Sorry, Richard, I lost you there. Are you losing in terms of, are you losing hope because of this? Is that what you said?
Well, it seems an uphill battle to get
Yeah.
through to such a big urban society.
And
It's
you know,
great.
yeah.
A middle class sort of people who go to farm shops, that's a different sort of category, but there aren't many of those.
Yeah.
You know, most people live in a big city and get food from Tesco's.
And
isn't that a huge uphill battle we've got?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest problems is food is so cheap. And when food is cheap, we don't value it and we throw it away. We're not connected to it. And that is a massive issue that we have. I mean, there's so many things that I could answer to your question there, that there's so many things that need to change. And the reason people don't, it's like I get asked questions by kids when I give talks and they say milk comes from a green topped bottle. They don't know it comes from a cow. And that's really frustrating. But then I have to think, I'm glad they're asking the question that I can talk about it. But often when I go into schools and talk to kids, that might be the only time they ever speak to someone that knows about farming. Because I go into inner city Glasgow and speak to kids, and that might be one engagement. There's not the consistency. So my concern sometimes is we have these great charities and educational initiatives, but where's the consistency to build the learning, to build the understanding? That needs to improve. There's a few that I've seen out there, like Farmer Time, where they kind of dial in every few months and have seasonal updates, they build relationships. But in general, these initiatives aren't getting out to the city because they have to find a teacher in schools who's interested in farming. That's hard enough in itself. But then is that on us as an industry? Are we just speaking to ourselves constantly? Is all of our PR going out to ourselves? Are we spending like money talking to ourselves? And I think sometimes with levy bodies, farmers will say, what are you spending our money on? Because they want to see it. But if they're seeing it, then it's not being spent externally. So we've got to start thinking, how are we externally communicating to shift the narrative that you're explaining? Because it's not luxury, it's a necessity. Food is a core necessity. But I think because it's cheap, we dispose of it. That we can't really fix because they want to keep food cheap, because that's going to be, that's a whole kind of social economic conversation in itself. But I think we've got to be a lot more present as agriculture. Why it's easy sometimes for us to not really go into cities, to go to conferences only about ourselves, to only show up in our hordes in London when there's a protest, when it's about ourselves. But when there was issues around doctors and railway workers, where are the farmers? Integrate into other conversations that matter and connect with people in society that really care. That's where I think we need to get better at, is not only showing up when it's just affecting us. We've got to show that we care about everything that's going on if we want people to care and value in return. I just think we need to show up much better. We've got to be more accessible. I absolutely agree with you, Richard. Clarkson, I struggle with Clarkson. I see him as a great opportunity, a great example of someone that can communicate well. But you're blooming right. He shouldn't be our example of farming that's out there. There's got to be other people. But I'm hoping what he's done is pave the way for a conversation. And like I said, a masterclass in how to communicate. Because what Clarkson does that we do not do well is he asks dumb questions, which we all want to ask and we're too shy to. And he's very much layman's material. He passes the pub test. And if you all know what passing the pub test is, Clarkson does it because everybody understands what he says, and we tend to get stuck in technical jargon. So I think, this is all lots of things that we could be doing differently, but we've got to show up. We've got to show up much better, but it's going to take so much time. Like I think I said to Nigel or Paul earlier.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Is that okay, Richard?
Yes, yeah, no, it's an uphill battle, but we've got to start somewhere, haven't we?
Yeah, and I so appreciate your question, it's such an important question, and it's not something again it's going to happen overnight, but it's so valid. And actually, in the UK, what I will say is we don't have an excuse of we have people on our doorstep. In Australia, I think 90% of the population live within 50 kilometers of the coast. They have a real issue on their hands. I was driving for 10 10 hours without seeing anybody. But we don't have that in the UK. We can get to people really easily. We've got to use that to our advantage, because I think we've got more opportunity here in the UK than almost every country I've visited in the world when it comes to connection and engagement.
That's really interesting, Claire. And as you say, it's just how do you do that communication piece, and how do you get to those people which aren't in the room today? Nigel.
I was wondering, Katie, if you could go to Eric first, because I'm sure his question will be a lot better than mine.
Okay, Eric.
Right. Excellent presentation, Claire. Throughout the UK, we must have, I don't know what the numbers are, but 50, 60, 70,000 farmers. And there's, in Northern Ireland, there's 6 counties. I don't know how many there are in Scotland and England. But I believe if we start off at schools, if we start off at the colleges, the 12 to 18, and even universities, and bring those groups of people to our farms, open our doors, let them see what's going on. We have, well, I'd say 5 or 6 retailers, major retailers, probably 3 top retailers and 4 or 5 them below that, who are very, very supportive of all of the UK food industry. And we have, just to your left, looking at the screen, ABP, with Katie here representing, with training for each county to have at least 3 or 4, I'm going to call them open farms, properly trained. We could do a magnificent job, not in years, but in a year or 2. If those 3 or 4 farms in every county were properly trained, proud to open their doors to let the younger folk in, let the university people in, and there are piles of projects that we could be doing that would get universities involved as well, whether it's water consumption or just getting weights of cattle onto a computer screen, on a monthly basis. Can we do that electronically? There are so many things that we could do, and we just need good training, whether it's from yourself or whether it's from ABP or whether it's from government. But there's such an excitement, I believe, left in farming. And I'm coming up to 82 years of age, but if I was like Sam or Crosby, young fellas, plenty of life still in them, there's huge opportunities here for us. And we should not get negative. We have one of the best industries in the world. And I believe with ownership of it, and you can see the support the farmers throughout the UK got in London here and locally as well. So it's a matter of getting the right messages out, and we just need a bit of training. The Farmers Union, I believe, could be a very useful tool to help us, being supported by the factories and by the retail trade, because the retail trade wants safe food as well. And they want it to be produced even more efficiently, and it could be done much more efficiently. And it's just more training. So thank you for your presentation. It is well done, but it just shows you we have an awful lot of work to do, and we need our factories, we need our NFU, or farmers unions of the UK, to actually give us a bit more training. Those 3 or 4 farms in every county, and even support them. Whether it's providing some food or whatever the story is, or some project on the farm that would really excite people, so that they could see how the industry is developing. But thank you for your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Eric. And I just think that's such a great idea. I mean, because what you've solved in one comment is the reason why we're not getting enough people on farms from schools is because people are scared of health and safety. They're scared of all these issues. But if you had touch points which were certified, you had training, in that sense, I love that idea, because there's no roadblock there that teachers can say we're not going to engage, because it's tried and tested. It's got consistency. There's other schools or projects that are using it. Your other point that I love is the idea is make it a farm to fork experience where you have the working farm, you show the technological advancements. Farming is not about milking by hand, which is what we show at every single, agricultural show. Show the milking parlour, show clusters and rotatory systems, show that side of things. but also show if you can have the retail there, like have the supermarket, have the abattoir. I mean, I've been to some amazing visits at some of the abattoirs of ABP, and actually, if you link up the journey as an experience, I think people understand the journey of food a lot better. So I think, and all of that, what does that do, Eric? It does collaboration between all these stakeholders as well. So all of it's a plus. So I think it's a great idea. Maybe you should be part of it too. I love your enthusiasm.
Thanks, Eric. Sam.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Claire. Marvelous talk there. And actually, I agree with Eric. That's a very good idea. We have focused farms and technology farms here in Northern Ireland. That's only for farmers. Two things. How do you deal with negativity? I'm sick going to meetings and sick. I've actually deleted WhatsApp groups where everybody's complaining. Farmers are always complaining. There's no positive. No positive. I see Crosby shaking his head too. Nobody's positive anymore. They can't think of anything good to say. We had a demonstration with 6,200 people at it last Monday night. They were only to complain because they couldn't get in. They were complaining about that, not about the positive message that we were sending. Farmers are very, very poor at that. And the other thing is, you've had fantastic travels throughout the world, and I'm sure people are wondering, how could you afford to take time off work, and how was it funded? Very personal question that, but how was it funded? Because I could go on one, but I think I'm too old for that now. But
no, it's a great both great questions. The negativity one, oh God, I get it, and I find, and I am like bursting with positivity, and sometimes I can get really dragged down, a bit like my comment earlier about why do we see dog shit and we step in it and we don't walk around it. Positivity is contagious, and when I speak at events or when I give, I'm hosting conferences and things, I do see a difference if the people behind the microphone or the people who are organizing it, if they are positive and engaging and inspiring, it does make a difference. But you need to have the people that are representing the people in positions of leadership have to be absolutely talking about being proud of their industry. They've got to be much more positive, and you've got to call it out. I mean, I call it out all the time when I go places and people are negative. And because I always say, if you behave like this, how do you expect young people to want to see a future in this industry? We've got to start pulling on the positives and actually talking about it and celebrating it a lot more. But I know, Sam, and I know, Crosby, we've spoken about this before, and the negativity that's placed at the sector. But I think collectively, we've got to start calling it out. And it's like my comment about tall poppy syndrome. I am fed up of seeing farmers who are doing really exciting and innovative and brave things, and people say, oh gosh, well, that wasn't what your forebears did before, they'd be turning in their grave. I've spoken to young farmers who have done things against the grain and they've ended up reaping such benefits, but the whole way they have been dragged down by negativity. But then once they get out there, they've got to be the kind of game changers that inspire people. So that, I think, we've got to call it out. We've got to think about positivity being infectious. We've all got to make more of an effort to not just sit in the negativity. And I hold my hand up and say, I'm very positive and I got dragged down. If you'd asked them, Katie spoke to me back in the summer, I was in a really negative headspace. I was quite low because all I was hearing was negative, like those things on the screen with my mind map, farming is reactive, it's blinkered, it's blame. I was so low because all I could see was a negative, and I had to forcefully get myself out of that space and think, no, there is a good story, there is a positive, but I had to will myself to do that. Your second question about funding. So I had a sponsor initially. So the Royal Highland Agricultural Society of Scotland was an amazing sponsor, and they gave me quite a big chunk of money. But then, because I decided to go quite rogue and do a lot more travel, most scholars would do 3 months of travel maximum. I have done 9 months of travel. That's a lot of money. I did get some extra sponsorship from a few different organisations, which was wonderful. And they were like, for example, AgriScot, you'll know AgriScot, the business event, they were wonderful. They reached out to me. The Scottish Dairy Council Association in Scotland reached out to me. Jane Craigie Marketing. There's a few people that reached out and were really supportive of me because they so believed in what I was doing and they believed in my positive storytelling. That still didn't cover it. During my travels, I quit my job and I decided to go completely freelance, and I didn't earn money really that much when I was traveling because I'm a columnist. Columnists get paid absolute pittance. You don't do it for the money, you do it because you care about the message. So I really haven't earned a lot of money now for 2 years, and I used my savings to fund the other half of my travel. But it was the best investment I ever made because I wasn't going to go back to university. I'm not overly academic. I don't really respond to being lectured to. I need to be on the ground speaking to real people. So this was my university experience, my master's, worth I think I put about £10,000 of my own up against it. And it was so worth it. And I wouldn't regret a thing because of the people I've met. But it is challenging. And I'm very lucky because I host conferences. I've hosted a few conferences along the way, which has paid for my plane tickets occasionally. But it's moving forward, I do need to make some money. So nobody's going to take advice from me on commerciality anyway. But it's my next step.
No, well done, Claire. Nigel, did you want to ask your final question this evening?
Well, it's a comment probably more than a question, and probably go against the grain of.
It needs to be positive.
Well, yeah, well, that's why it is. It's positive because there's been a lot of negativity. Well, we've been talking about negativity, shall we say? And there are a lot of people out there doing stuff. There's loads of bloggers. Ollie Harrison. There's a lot of stuff. Abby Reader from South Wales has done a lot with Cows on Tour, which has been really good. And there's people like Ian Piggott, who writes in the Farmers Weekly, who I've heard speak. There's so much for this sort of thing. And we all forget about Adam Henson too. He's put his bit in on Countryfile. And on top of that, the NFU, they have an educational team who work on working with schools and putting together programs that fit in with the curriculum. So there is a lot going on. So it's not all bad. And the same time, back to Clarkson, I got a lot of time with Jeremy Clarkson, actually. He's an advantage, obviously, because of his notoriety, but he does a lot of tomfoolery to make a very serious point. Mm-hmm. And if you pick that out, he's well worth listening to.
I think that's a really good point, is the fact he uses humor, because how do we connect with people? It's through emotions, it's through empathy, it's through showing like how we can relate to people. And I think Clarkson is an expert in finding relevance in the people that listen. You've got to remember he's a journalist turned farmer, so he knows how to win over an audience. He's an expert in that. I'm very aware of that. But we can all learn from him that we're not very good sometimes at speaking human to human and connecting with people. Because I'm very aware that when I give talks, sometimes my content isn't going to be like mind-blowing. I'm not going to be delivering some innovation that's going to change the game for agriculture, because I'm not. That isn't what I do. But I try and connect with people on an emotional level, and that's what leaves a lasting impression. That's what makes people want to change. That's always the thing I've really learned. It's about how you connect and how you care with people. And you're right, Nigel, there are so many amazing people. I think Abby's fantastic, some of the work that she does. And I mean, there's just countless people that are online doing that, and they're getting really good at actually collaborating with each other. And I saw that with the protests this week. There's so many farming influencers that I chat to that we're all meeting up and sharing and tagging each other. We are getting better at that. But before, a lot of these efforts were kind of done in vain. They're a little bit siloed. They weren't always thinking about how do we connect a lot more. So I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is a massive change in that. But we won't reap the benefits of that for a few years. But I think we're going to see a massive change in a few years, massive change.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you so much for sharing your amazing travels with us and all the experiences you've learned along the way. It's been really fascinating to see, and I'm sure everybody else, there's lots of clapping there, I can see. Yeah, everyone's really enjoyed that, and I'm sure those that haven't joined us this evening will enjoy it when they watch back as well. So we all need to go and find our radiators and not the drains, and try and stay as positive as we can. So let's try and keep that positivity up. And if you start getting negative or hear negative comments, hopefully Claire's happy, smiley voice will be ringing in your ear to make you smile and be more positive and try and convert whoever is being negative round. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks again, Claire, and stay positive.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.